What fate awaited the wives and daughters of men defeated by the Vikings? Archaeologists, monks, and sagas all agree on one thing: capture was often worse than death. It began in 793 CE, at Lindisfarne. The Northumbrian monks who survived wrote of slaughter, holy men cut down, treasures looted, but their words also hint at something more. Women dragged from their homes, screaming, bound with rope, and forced onto ships as spoils of war. For the English world, this was a first taste of Viking violence. For the women, it was the beginning of a centuries-long nightmare. That raid was just the beginning. Across the English coasts, through Ireland, into Francia and beyond, the same horror repeated itself. Villages burned in the night. Husbands and fathers cut down in the fields. Mothers screaming as their daughters were dragged away, helpless to intervene. What awaited them was not freedom, not ransom, not even the dignity of death in battle. What awaited them was captivity. To understand the terror, you have to know how the Norse viewed human lives. In their world, captives were not just trophies. They were a form of wealth, living silver, bodies turned into currency. Men taken as slaves became field hands, miners, or were sold in distant lands. But women, especially the wives and daughters of warriors, were forced into a far darker fate. They were concubines, bed slaves, and breeders. A noblewoman who once wore the keys of her household at her belt, a symbol of authority in Viking society, would find those keys ripped from her waist, replaced by chains. Her life, her status, her identity erased in an instant. Now she was property, no different from livestock. We know this not only from sagas, but also from archaeology. Excavations in Dublin and Hedeby have revealed shackles of different sizes, some clearly forged for adult women, others small enough for children. Written accounts from Arabic travelers like Ibn Fadlan describe Viking slave markets, where young women were examined, sold, and used as commodities. The Irish annals echo the same grief: entire communities taken, women shipped away never to return. And it was systematic. These were not crimes of passion committed in the heat of a raid. This was an economy. From Ireland to the Black Sea, Viking networks bought and sold captives, moving them across thousands of miles. A captured wife might end up in the household of a Norse settler in Dublin, or just as easily in the slave markets of Byzantium. Imagine the fear this spread. Women knew what awaited them if their husbands and sons fell. They knew their bodies would become spoils, their children torn from their arms. This fear was so powerful that in some chronicles, there are hints of women choosing death rather than slavery. For them, the sword or the sea was mercy compared to what lay in Viking hands. For the wives of defeated warriors, captivity was not survival. It was erasure. And that, more than the flames of burning villages or the clash of swords, is what made the Viking Age so haunting. For the wives of defeated warriors, captivity was not survival. It was erasure. And that, more than the flames of burning villages or the clash of swords, is what made the Viking Age so haunting. The chronicles of the time preserve the terror. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by monks who saw the raids firsthand, tells of homes reduced to ash and entire families dragged into the night. The Irish annals, year after year, record villages left empty, women and children carried to the ships. These accounts are not the exaggerations of poets. They are the desperate memories of those who watched their loved ones vanish into chains. And this is what matters most: these abductions were not random acts of cruelty, not drunken raids carried out by reckless men. They were deliberate, calculated, and central to the Viking economy. Human lives were coin, and women were its highest currency. Picture it. The smoke of burning thatch stings your eyes. The smell of blood mingles with salt air as the longships wait on the shore. Your husband lies in the mud, his body broken by an axe. Around you, screams rise, your neighbor's daughter dragged by her hair, your sister struck down as she clutches her child. You beg, you plead, but the warriors do not listen. They are not here for mercy. They are here for you. Imagine the iron biting into your wrists, the chain forcing you forward step by step. You stumble, but they yank you upright. Behind you, your home burns. Ahead of you, the sea yawns open, the path to a fate darker than death. Those who were captured became thralls, slaves with no rights, no future, and no escape. Men worked the fields, rowed the ships, or perished in mines. But women, wives, daughters, even children, were forced into roles more degrading still. They were concubines, trophies, breeders. To the Vikings, their wombs were wealth. Every child born to a thrall woman became another slave, another profit for the household. The sagas give us glimpses of this horror. Tales of noblewomen paraded as spoils, of widows bound and given to chieftains, of daughters stolen in the night. The chronicles echo the same grief, written in voices that break across the centuries. These were not stories told to frighten children. They were lived nightmares. Archaeology strengthens the tale. At sites across Dublin, shackles have been unearthed, iron bands sized for men, for women, and chillingly, for children. Some are so small they could only have bound wrists the size of a 7-year-old. These finds are not relics of isolated cruelty. They are the artifacts of a trade that spanned continents, a trade where human suffering was measured in silver. And this trade was vast. From Ireland to the markets of the East, captives were moved across thousands of miles. A wife taken in Wessex might be sold in Dublin, resold in Hedeby, and shipped as far as the slave bazaars of Byzantium. Every step of her journey stripped her further from her past, until nothing remained but the chain around her neck and the price paid for her body. The Vikings did not just destroy lives. They shattered communities. For every wife stolen, a household was broken. For every daughter sold, a lineage ended. This was psychological warfare as much as physical, designed to leave survivors haunted, broken, and powerless. And so the women understood. When the sails appeared on the horizon, when the horn sounded, they knew what was coming. Some resisted. Some prayed. Some chose the blade or the river rather than the longship. For they knew that what waited on the other side of capture was a fate far worse than death. This was the reality of Viking conquest, not just the clash of steel, but the silent suffering of wives and daughters. The legacy of blood and chains that haunted every shore they touched. And it is only the beginning. If you want to uncover more of the truths history tried to bury, the stories too dark for the sagas, too painful for the chronicles, make sure you subscribe to Tale of History. Because what comes next will haunt you even more. This was only the beginning. For those who survived the chaos of the raids, the true ordeal had just begun. The Vikings had a word for the enslaved, thralls. A thrall was not a person in their eyes, not a mother or a daughter, not a wife or a sister. A thrall was property. She could be bought, sold, given as a gift, or discarded without consequence. In a world where honor and freedom were prized above all else, to be a thrall was to have your very identity stripped away. For men, slavery meant backbreaking labor in fields, quarries, and workshops. But for women, the reality was darker still. Many became concubines, forced into their captors' beds, their bodies turned into tools of pleasure and reproduction. Others worked the farms, grinding grain, herding animals, or carrying water until their hands bled and their backs broke. Some were taken not for work but for trade, human merchandise destined for markets across the Viking world. Dublin was one of the largest of these hubs. Once a small settlement on the Irish coast, it became a Viking stronghold where the trade in human lives thrived. Archaeologists have uncovered the evidence: iron shackles, some heavy and wide for men, others narrower and lighter for women, and chillingly, tiny bands sized for children. These are not symbols of war trophies, they are the infrastructure of an industry. But Dublin was not alone. The markets of Hedeby in modern-day Germany, the ports of the Baltic, and even the great rivers flowing eastward all became arteries in a vast network of human trafficking. Women taken from English or Irish villages could be marched across Europe, sold and resold until they stood on the blocks of distant slave markets, staring into the faces of buyers who spoke languages they did not understand. Some would be carried as far as the Black Sea, others into the markets of Byzantium, where their fair skin and hair made them exotic and highly prized. And the value of women in this grim economy was not measured by their strength in the fields but by their fertility. A woman's body was an investment. Every child she bore was another thrall, another profit for the household. The Norse sagas speak of women who bore children to their masters, their sons and daughters born into bondage with no hope of freedom. The womb itself became a marketplace, a factory of flesh and suffering. We know this not only from archaeology but also from the words of outsiders who saw it with their own eyes. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, writing in the 10th century, described the Vikings along the Volga River. He tells us of markets where women were sold openly, examined like livestock, and taken as concubines by traders. To him, these practices were shocking, but to the Vikings, they were business as usual. This system was not hidden, not shameful. It was normalized. A Viking household might have owned several thralls, some working in the fields, others serving at the table, and one or more forced into the master's bed. These women had no escape, no voice, and no choice. They were expected to obey, to endure, to suffer in silence. And this is the most haunting truth. For the Viking world, the suffering of women was not collateral damage of war. It was the machinery of their society. Their economy thrived on it, their culture absorbed it, and their legends were built on the backs of those whose names we will never know. Every bracelet of silver, every feast in a chieftain's hall, every voyage across the sea was paid for, in part, by the lives of women turned into thralls. Their chains were the silent currency of empire. And as we peel back the layers of this history, we begin to see the true darkness of the Viking Age, not just in the burning villages or the bloodied fields, but in the quiet suffering of the women whose stories were almost erased. If you want to keep uncovering these hidden truths, the side of history the sagas tried to bury, subscribe now to Tale of History. Because what comes next will reveal just how deep this nightmare went. If captivity stripped women of their freedom, what came next stripped them of their very humanity. The sagas and chronicles are not gentle in their hints. They whisper of women forced into concubinage, of widows claimed by the men who killed their husbands, of daughters dragged into the darkness of longhouses as spoils of war. The monks who recorded the Viking raids could not always bring themselves to write the details, but their silence is as telling as their words. Behind the burned monasteries and shattered towns lay a reality too shameful to set down plainly: the systematic violation of women. For the Vikings, rape was not merely an act of violence. It was an assertion of dominance, a brutal stamp of ownership. A wife captured in war did not return as a wife, she returned as property, her body transformed into another man's right. Her humiliation was a public declaration of conquest, her suffering a spectacle that magnified her captor's power. And among these victims, widows and noblewomen were prized above all others. Their capture meant more than pleasure, it meant prestige. A chieftain who paraded a noble captive at his side was flaunting his victory, just as much as if he had displayed stolen treasure. A woman of high birth became a living trophy, her fall from power amplifying the triumph of her conqueror. The symbolism of this was unmistakable. In Norse society, a free woman often wore keys at her belt, keys that marked her authority as mistress of her household, the one who controlled food stores, valuables, and even the fate of servants. But when those women were taken, the keys were ripped from their waists and replaced with chains. What once signified power now became a reminder of their captivity. Imagine it. A noblewoman who once stood at the head of a great hall, giving orders to servants, balancing accounts, deciding who entered her lord's household, now forced to kneel at the feet of strangers. The keys that once jingled at her side, a sound of dignity and authority, replaced by the clink of shackles that announced her as nothing more than a thrall. And it was not only physical domination, it was psychological destruction. To strip away the symbols of her life, to break her body and her spirit, was to erase her completely. She would not be remembered as the wife of a warrior or the mother of a clan. She would be remembered only as spoils, her identity swallowed by the silence of history. Even worse, her suffering was inherited. If she bore children in captivity, those children were born as thralls, their lives shackled before they had taken their first breath. Her humiliation echoed across generations, ensuring that her bloodline remained broken and enslaved. This is why the chronicles often speak of women wailing, of cries that carried through the night. These were not only the cries of grief, they were the cries of women who understood what was coming, who knew that their bodies would become the battlegrounds of conquest. The sagas may glorify the battles, the voyages, the feasts. But behind every tale of Viking triumph is another story, darker, rarely told, the women whose chains became symbols of power, whose humiliation was celebrated as victory. This is the side of the Viking Age that lingers like a shadow, the part that haunts not with the clash of swords but with the silence of broken voices. If you want more of these untold truths, the hidden stories the sagas refuse to celebrate, subscribe now to Tale of History. Because what waits in the next chapter of this nightmare is even darker than what you have just heard. The humiliation of captivity did not end in the longhouse. For many women and children, it was only the beginning of a far more merciless journey. Their chains did not stay in one village, nor in one land. They were marched, beaten, and ferried across seas to the heart of a system more chilling than the raids themselves, the slave markets of the Viking world. Among these, Dublin became infamous. Founded as a Viking stronghold, it grew into one of the largest slave trading hubs in medieval Europe. Here, human lives were transformed into silver and gold, their worth calculated in coins, their suffering measured on scales. The Irish annals speak of countless raids that ended with captives funneled into Dublin, where they were sorted, priced, and sold like livestock. The process was brutally systematic. Men and women were separated, their value determined by age, strength, and usefulness. Children were especially vulnerable. To the Vikings, a child represented not just immediate profit but long-term value, years of labor, years of fertility, years of servitude waiting to be extracted. Buyers looked at them not as sons and daughters, but as investments. A child's small frame was not a sign of weakness. It was a promise of decades of ownership. Archaeological excavations in Dublin have revealed the scars of this trade. Shackles rusted into fragments, their iron still shaped to fit slender wrists and ankles. Human remains show trauma consistent with captivity, bones bearing the marks of strain, malnutrition, and violence. These were not the remains of free people living ordinary lives. They were the bones of those whose bodies were worked, broken, and discarded. And Dublin was not unique. The same pattern emerges in Hedeby, in Birka, across the Baltic, and down the rivers that connected Scandinavia to the east. The Viking slave trade was not an accident of war. It was an industry. Ports were built to facilitate it. Markets flourished to exploit it. Every raid fed the machine, and every captive became fuel for a system designed to strip humanity and turn it into currency. The chronicles paint the horror in muted words, but between the lines lies the truth. Mothers forced to watch as their children were led away. Husbands powerless as their wives were auctioned to strangers. Families divided forever, their names lost, their stories silenced. Imagine standing in that marketplace. Imagine the sound of chains clinking as captives are herded forward. Imagine the auctioneer's voice rising above the crowd, calling prices, while children cry in languages no one around them understands. Imagine the hopeless eyes of a mother watching her daughter pulled onto a block, knowing that her child's value is measured not in love or kinship but in silver pieces stacked on a scale. This was the true face of Viking power, not only the battlefield, but the marketplace. A place where fear, grief, and despair were traded as commodities, where the suffering of women and children became the foundation of wealth. And the echoes of those markets still haunt the earth today, in the rusted shackles buried in the soil, in the bones marked by chains, in the silence of lives erased. If you want to keep uncovering the shadows of history, the parts too dark for sagas and too painful for chronicles, subscribe now to Tale of History. Because the story of Viking slavery is not finished, and the next chapter is darker still. Not everyone who faced Viking capture submitted to chains. Some chose another path, one of fire, of blade, of water. In the medieval chronicles, scattered like whispers, are stories of men, women, and even children who decided that death was preferable to the slow torment of slavery. The Irish annals describe villages cornered by raiders, where women hurled themselves into rivers rather than be dragged to the ships. Entire families perished in the waves, their cries drowned beneath the roar of water and war. Some accounts speak of mothers smothering their own children, sparing them from the auction block, sparing them from the humiliation of bondage. These were not acts of despair alone, but acts of defiance, resistance against a fate designed to strip them of dignity. Others found fire to be their final refuge. Chronicles tell of people barricading themselves inside wooden hulls, setting the beams alight, choosing to burn with their homes rather than be led away in chains. The flames consumed them, but their freedom, in that final moment, was their own. And yet, many never had the chance to choose. The Viking raids were swift, merciless, leaving little time for escape. For every village that resisted, countless others were caught in the tidal wave of steel and fire, swept into a system that valued human lives as currency. Still, those acts of refusal echo through the centuries. They reveal the terror the Vikings inspired, not just as warriors, but as slavers. When people would rather drown, rather burn, rather cut their own throats than fall into Norse hands, it tells us everything about what awaited the captives who survived. This was the atmosphere of fear that stretched across Europe in the Viking Age. The raids were not only physical assaults, but psychological ones, searing into memory and legend. The very mention of dragon-headed ships on the horizon was enough to make entire villages scatter, women and children fleeing into forests, or praying desperately that death would come swiftly. These choices, death before dishonor, fire before chains, drowning before captivity, speak to the scale of horror. They remind us that the Viking story was not all glory, discovery, or exploration. For the conquered, it was fear so overwhelming that even life itself sometimes seemed unbearable. And this is only one fragment of the truth. The full story of Viking slavery, resistance, and survival is far darker, and it demands to be told. If you want to uncover more of these forgotten voices, the ones silenced by chains and flames, then subscribe now to Tale of History. Together, we'll drag the buried truths of the past back into the light, no matter how dark they may be. For the wives of defeated warriors, capture by the Vikings was not survival. It was a slow unraveling of everything they were. Freedom stripped away, dignity torn apart, their very bodies turned into coin. Slavery, rape, humiliation, these were not rare exceptions, but the machinery that drove Viking wealth and power. The battlefield ended lives quickly, but captivity was a fate worse than death. The auction blocks of Dublin, the longhouses of Scandinavia, the riverside market stretching to the Black Sea, they all whispered the same truth: a woman's scream could be silenced, her name erased, but her suffering was carefully counted, priced, and sold. And yet, their shadows remain. In the rusted shackles dug from the earth. In the scratches carved into stone by trembling hands. In the quiet lines of the chronicles that could not bear to write more. These voices do not fade. They echo like a nightmare that refuses to die, reminding us that behind the legends of Viking conquest lies a darker legacy, one of women broken and children lost. This is the truth history rarely tells, but it is the truth that must be remembered. Because to forget their suffering is to let silence win again. If you want more stories stripped bare of myth and told with the raw edge of reality, subscribe now to Tale of History. Together, we will continue to uncover the darkest corners of the past, because history is not only glory, it is also the shadows we dare not ignore.